Everybody, today we are starting Unit 7, Day 3, and we're going to talk about imperialism. I'm going to tell you that today's presentation is going to be a little bit long because we're covering a lot of different points, a lot of different areas of the world as far as discussing imperialism. So this video is going to be a lot longer than I would normally want it to be, but I feel it's important so that we can hit on everything all together. And you can kind of see how all these different pieces fit together as well. This political cartoon right here really symbolizes what the United States is going to become as a result of imperialism during this time. This is a little meme here that came out when things were going kind of crazy in Ukraine. I encourage you to take a look at that and just think about what you think of that cartoon. So, expansion. In 1880s, the U.S. population was 50 million, which was now rivaling that of European powers. To this point, we had been behind Europe as far as population went. Our industrial production was second only to Great Britain in the world. And you will see that even though we had had disputes with France, Mexico, and Great Britain since the 1840s, there was no large-scale issues that we had really had with each of the sides. There was no doubt that the U.S. was willing to get involved diplomatically if we needed to, even though we were under like the Monroe Doctrine and other policies like that, trying to keep us out of other countries. So Gilded Age diplomacy. You're going to see that during this time that many Americans didn't have a ton of interest, and politicians didn't really have an interest in getting involved in foreign relations. European affairs focused on the France-German rivalry in the Balkans, but again, the U.S. didn't really show any interest in that. And actually, the U.S. Navy had been reduced in size since the Civil War. Chester A. Arthur had begun upgrading that, but outside of that, you're not going to see really a lot happening as far as the military. In 1890, you will see that Congress appropriates funds for 3 battleships to help in the creation of a 2-sea Navy, both the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific. Before this, again, we had no concern or no need to have a Navy in the Pacific. And you see Teddy Roosevelt's quote there. Oh Lord, if only the people who are ignorant of our Navy could see these great warships and they could realize how they could uphold the honor of America. So, why was there this sudden urge to expand? Well, one, you're going to have the search for foreign markets. Really here in the United States, you're going to see that the markets had become saturated in a lot of ways. So now companies, businesses, and eventually the government are going to look for new sources or new places to be able to sell goods. The U.S. GDP had quadrupled, but again, trying to stay ahead of the market trends and expand over into other areas. Foreign trade also was important for financing to get other countries to finance in businesses as well as trade with the United States and help stabilize our markets. Number 2, trade and diplomacy. Again, we just mentioned the trade, but also diplomacy was sufficient means to protect economic interests in Europe. And this wasn't the case in other places, but people started to see that if you traded and had a relationship with other countries, this would be important for developing relationships with those other countries, especially in Asia, Latin America, and other backwards areas as they were known during that time. You will see that European countries had picked up the imperialism that they were doing, especially in Africa. Japan had done the same thing. So in one way, we were trying to keep up with other countries that were starting to get more involved in around the world. So expansion starting after the Civil War as far as land goes. Secretary of State William Seward, he had led the drive to annex Midway Island in the Pacific. He had gained rights to build a canal in Nicaragua and purchase Alaska. Alaska had been purchased in 1867 for $7.2 million from Russia. For a long time, it was known as Seward's Folly because nobody really understood why we bought that immense amount of land from Russia. Russia at that time had just wanted to get rid of it. And now eventually Alaska will come to be very, very important because it is full of natural resources, and it would give the United States a presence in the northern Pacific. Napoleon III of France, he would send troops to occupy Mexico during the Civil War, but after the war, Seward invoked the Monroe Doctrine, and those troops would leave and go back to France. So really, you're going to see that's all that had kind of happened previously to this. So this is known as New Imperialism. And really, the reason they call that, it's got a lot of different reasons for it, but really it's going to take a new look, especially when you're looking at like Latin America. So the drive behind expansionism, again, social Darwinism, the idea if the U.S. wanted to survive, it must expand, it must grow, and we must grow in size if we wanted to survive. Also, a lot of people had a belief in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race. Again, this was not just U.S., this was also Europe as well, and said, hey, as a race, we are to extend throughout the world and also share our views and how we see the world with the rest of the world as well. So those are two drives behind it. Now, a book that's going to have a huge amount of influence during this time is going to be Alfred Thayer Mahan's The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And this shaped American thinking about how we viewed our role in the world. He said, first of all, oceans should not be regarded as barriers, but as highways. And if you're going to use the oceans extensively, you need to have very good Navy and also merchant marines to help protect ships as they're going across the ocean. Again, he says a powerful Navy would also be required for overseas bases for refueling. So he said, these ships, if they're going, especially over the Pacific, they need places to refuel, and a powerful Navy would be required for that. He also believed in the importance of a Central American canal, which of course will become the Panama Canal. And he believed that annexing Hawaii would be very important because Hawaii, at that center point in the Pacific, very good place for refueling stations and such. So his goal, he said, with this was not the idea of colonization, which he had seen a lot with imperialism earlier, but was the control of strategic points throughout the world. Teddy Roosevelt read this book, and Henry Cabot Lodge, a future senator, and they both agreed with this large policy as it was known. Also, at the same time, you would have Frederick Jackson Turner, who would write The Significance of the Frontier in American History. And he would talk about basically that the closing of the frontier, meaning we had already moved out to the west as far as we could, meant that overseas expansion was the next step, the next logical step to take with that if we wanted to keep up this idea of the frontier. You can see a quote there, movement has been a dominant fact unless this training has no effect upon people. The American energy will continue to demand a water field for its exercise. So again, he's just saying that we would expand out around the rest of the world. Also, Teddy Roosevelt, you would have him write in 1896, The Winning of the West. He would draw a parallel saying, hey, look how we expanded out and look how we moved the Indians out of the way. We can also do the rest around the world. He also said in there that it didn't really matter what happened to backward people because their conquest was for the benefit of mankind. So he's drawing that link between manifest destiny and this idea of imperialism, moving out of the country and taking other places. So starting with the Pacific and Hawaii, again, our main interest in the Pacific had been in the sugarcane industry, and we did a lot of trade of sugar with Hawaii. In 1875, we would sign a treaty with Hawaii that gave their sugar, had free entry into the United States. They didn't have to pay any tariffs. But with that, we declared the island off limits to other countries. Also in 1887, you will see that a treaty granted the U.S. naval rights at Pearl Harbor. Of course, we all know what later happens at Pearl Harbor. So in response to the McKinley tariff, which that tariff changed things in Hawaii and made it so that Hawaii was going to have to start paying American tariffs to bring their products into the country. So you're going to see that sugar planters start to plot an American takeover of the island so that sugar would be a domestic product and they would not have to pay the tax anymore. So 3 years later, you're going to have a revolt start against Queen L, as I like to call her, because I can't say her last name properly. And with that, she would be overthrown. She wouldn't be killed, but she would be overthrown and lose power there in Hawaii. An annex treaty was negotiated actually with the Harrison administration, but Grover Cleveland withdrew the treaty, saying it would go against American policy to acquire territory so far away. And again, there was, as Thomas Jefferson learned with the Louisiana Purchase, there was nothing specific in the Constitution talking about adding or annexing territory, and that's why Cleveland was against that. So now looking at Latin America. These Pan-American Conference, you're going to hear about these several times in U.S. history. James Blaine created this to try to establish closer ties between the U.S. and South America. It actually still exists today. It doesn't have the same name, but it does still exist today. There have been boundary disputes between Venezuela and Guyana, which was a British company during this time. President Cleveland pushed Britain to arbitrate. They refused. Cleveland invoked the Monroe Doctrine, and Britain agreed to the U.S. demands. Latin American countries at this time were thankful that the United States was involved and was playing a part within Latin America. And actually, this situation here in this conflict between Venezuela and Guyana, this would actually lead to a turning point in U.S.-Britain relations for the positive. They say after this, historians believe, again, the relationship between the United States and Great Britain actually grew a whole lot stronger, whereas before it hadn't really been strained, but it wasn't a very strong relationship. And now after this, we would view each other as very strong allies. So the first big event we're going to have to talk about with Latin America is the Spanish-American War. And this war is all caused because of Cuba. Cuba had attempted movements for independence from Spain numerous times throughout history. Again, it was still under the power of Spain during this time. And in 1895, Cuban patriots led by Jose Marti start a guerrilla war. Now, with this guerrilla war, what's going to happen is that the Spaniards control the towns and insurgents control the countrysides there. The Spanish commander that was in charge of Cuba during this time, he adopts a policy of reconcentration, which basically he set up what would be akin to like a concentration camp, forcing populations into these. And you're going to see as a result of that, over 200,000 Cubans would die of starvation, exposure, and dysentery. So Cuban rebels hope to draw the U.S. into the struggle, and you're going to see that Cubans come into the United States and they start trying to attract the attention of the media. And this is where you're going to have yellow journalism come in. The Wanta, a group of exiles, they set up in New York to make the case for a free Cuba. They would have largely gone unnoticed, but William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, both of them had newspapers, and they were in a newspaper battle over readership. Their attention is gotten by the Cuban exiles that are there, and they start printing out stories that these Cuban exiles are telling them. A lot of them very exaggerated stories. Some of them certainly were true, but some of them were very, very exaggerated. So as a result of this, these stories are being printed in newspapers. Americans are reading this, and Americans are starting to say, like, hey, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should intervene in Cuba to help out the people there. So as a result of that, Congress starts pushing for Cuban independence and protection of Cuban women from the lustful bondage of the Spanish. It was seen as the American thing to do to help stand up to the Spaniards. You can see in that first political cartoon there that is supposed to be a Cuban woman there being protected by Uncle Sam. So what was the presidential response in this situation? Grover Cleveland was concerned by the effect that the Cuban Civil War could have on trade and American sugar plantations within Cuba. He was worried that Spain's issues also might cause other European countries to intervene in the area, which he did not want to do. McKinley would largely agree with Cleveland, but desired to be tougher on the Spaniards because you have a switch in presidents during this time. So what is the buildup to the Spanish-American War? In September of 1897, the American minister informed Spain that it was time to put the stop to the destructive war before the U.S. was going to have to intervene. So basically he's saying, hey, end it or we're going to get involved. October of the same year, Spanish conservatives lose, leading liberals to take over in Spain, and they have a softened stance towards Cuba. Though you're going to see, though, January of the next year, Spanish loyalists in Havana riot against Spanish offers of autonomy. So they weren't happy with the liberals in Spain and what they were doing there. And that is why they riot, because they are upset that Cuba might be given its autonomy. February of that month, you're going to have what is known as the De Lome letter come out. This was a private letter published by William Hearst from the Spanish minister of the U.S. And in this letter, he basically insults the U.S. President McKinley throughout it. He says that McKinley was weak and that the Spanish basically weren't taking the U.S. seriously in this whole thing. So again, a lot of people will see this letter as an affront to the United States as a country, and people are not very, very happy with it. A week after that letter, so you already got people on edge in the Havana Harbor there in Cuba. You have the USS Maine parked there, and all of a sudden the USS Maine explodes in the Havana Harbor, killing many of the sailors on that. Now, the question with this is who did it and who would be blamed. The yellow journalists during that time, of course, they rushed to blame Spain. McKinley says, hey, we need to do an investigation of this. His assumption that it was somehow accidental. And so he said, hey, we need to take our time in this. Now, there would be an American investigative board during that time, and they would conclude that it had been caused by mine. Of course, everybody would blame that on Spain. In reality, historians looking at it now know that it actually wasn't a mine that blew it up, that they believe that because of the location and the gunpowder on the ship, that a hot coal somehow got from the coal rooms into the gunpowder, and that is what actually exploded the ship. Again, they didn't know that at that time. That's the best estimate they had. Still, with this, McKinley was very, very cautious about going to war. But he would eventually cave to business leaders and Americans who were very upset, who felt like Cuba had done this, and they would use the line, remember the Maine, to hell with Spain, is the tagline that people would use during this time. So he sends an ultimatum to Spain. Spain actually would agree on all points, but would not concede Cuban independence. They refused to give Cuba independence in this. So with that, April 11th, 1898, McKinley would ask Congress for authority to intervene in Cuba for the following reasons. He said, we have to put an end to barbaries, bloodshed, starvation, and horrible miseries. He said, we got to protect the life and property of U.S. citizens in Cuba. End the trade, the injury to trade and commerce that is happening as a result of the war going on there, and end the constant menace to our peace. So that means war is on. So now some key questions. With this, you're going to see the Teller Amendment will get passed, and that declares that the U.S. had no intention in taking political control of Cuba, and that after the war, Cuba would gain their own government. Basically saying, hey, we're not here to take over Cuba. We're helping out Cuba get control of their country away from the Spanish, and then we are done with that. So key questions, though, would remain. Did McKinley want to pursue other islands? Is this war going to expand in places outside of Cuba? Was this a war of American aggression to seize strategic territory that people were definitely interested in? Or was the United States just itching to display its new Navy and military might? We had been building up the Navy a little bit. Maybe we just wanted to use the Navy in this. So as far as the war goes, April 24th, Spain would declare war on us. Teddy Roosevelt would join the war as well. He would be part of the Rough Riders Cavalry Unit, and many other Americans would volunteer their services. And you're going to see that with this war, it's going to be super mismatched. Spain didn't really have anything to match our battleships, our armored cruisers, and just the numbers that we had on our side during this. So there are going to be a couple campaigns of this war, one in the Pacific campaign. The Philippines had also been under the power of the Spanish during that time and had been very, very unhappy with that as well. So that's why the war also is going to have a Pacific focus as well. You'll see May 1898, American ships led by John Dewey. They would corner the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay and basically destroy it. By August of that year, Manila had fallen, and the United States will eventually decide to build a military base there. And again, why would we build a military base there? Well, the Philippines, very, very strategic there, close to China, Japan, other countries we would want to be traded with. July of that year, Hawaii would officially be annexed finally. And again, remember that strategic location there in the middle of the Pacific. The Cuban front of the war. Spanish forces, again, like I said, they were not prepared. They weren't ready for this. Spanish forces were already pretty depleted from the long guerrilla war they had been fighting. July of 1898, you have the Battle of San Juan Hill. There, Roosevelt's Rough Riders would seize Kettle Hill and began a frontal assault against San Juan Heights. That frontal assault actually had been led by all black regiments during this, and you're going to see the Spaniards retreat. And then by July, by 2 days later, the Spanish fleet attempts to run the American blockade. Their fleet is destroyed, and a couple of days later, they surrender. So like I said, the Spanish were very, very outmatched in this war in pretty much every regard, which would lead to their quick defeat. So the end, what does the end look like? One, the recognition of Cuban independence, which is what we had been pushing for. Two, the U.S. would acquire 2 Spanish islands, Puerto Rico and Guam. And the reason that we wanted those was for refueling bases. And again, you might be wondering, well, this was about Cuban independence. How did we end up with islands? Well, it's almost kind of like our payment back for getting involved in the war and sacrificing. And I'm sure that's how a lot of Americans felt about it too. And then the last part is that we would acquire the Philippines for $20 million. And this is going to be something that really shocked people, because people are like, again, why are we acquiring the Philippines? Like, how did that become part of this equation? But it would. And it would be a very problematic part of this equation that you are going to see. Again, you see here this political cartoon, a very famous one to show the results of this here. You see the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Panama there, and now us exerting our influence over it. Now, you would have a group known as the anti-imperialists, or people that were anti-imperialism, who did not like this idea. They said, look at the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't give us the authority to just acquire territory for colonies or to just conquer these people and hold them in subjugation. Anti-imperialists did not want to make Filipino Americans those savage people. Basically, they didn't want the Philippines to turn into us just taking over these people, and why are we doing it? Andrew Carnegie actually would offer $20 million. He said, look, I will give the government back the $20 million if they give independence to the Philippines. Samuel Gompers was another person. He had a different angle on it, being the leader of a labor union. He worried that somehow like people were going to be imported in from the Philippines as workers in factories and be cheap labor competition for his people. Now, this movement never became very, very popular. The Democrats really waffled on this. You're going to see for the large part, even though Americans were kind of confused as to why we got the Philippines, there wasn't like this massive uproar of, hey, we should give the Philippines their independence. Now, the people of the Philippines were outraged by the treaty, and they said, hey, like, we supported the U.S. in this because we felt like we were going to get our independence just like Cuba was. So you're going to see in 1899, fighting would break out between American and Filipino patrols, led by Emilio Aguinaldo, who he had actually helped the U.S. in the war, in the Spanish-American War. And this would drag on until 1902. You would end with 4,200 American deaths and many, many more Filipinos. Actually, there would be more bloodshed with the war in the Philippines than there would be with the Spanish-American War, though. But yeah, in the end of this war, the Philippines would not get their independence. That'll come much later. So what are some other effects of the Spanish-American War? You're going to have the insular cases, which the Supreme Court rules that constitutional rights are not automatically extended to territorial possessions, that Congress could decide that was a congressional question. So basically, we take over these new cases or these new areas. That doesn't mean they are instantly covered by the Constitution. Also, you have the Platt Amendment. This required Cuba to agree to never sign a treaty with a foreign power that endangered its independence. Another big part of it that a lot of Cubans did not like is that it said that the U.S. could intervene in Cuba if freedom was threatened. And again, that was done in a very, very vague way. So it's like, well, what do you define as freedom being threatened? Like, what exactly does that mean? Also, it allowed us to maintain naval bases in Cuba, specifically Guantanamo Bay, which hasn't been in the news here recently. It was a lot in the past, though, because that is where we have a detention center these days for terrorists from the Middle East. But yeah, so this Platt Amendment, again, gives us a lot of power over Cuba, even though we aren't governing Cuba. Also, the election of 1900, we've mentioned this one before, where Teddy Roosevelt will be the vice president, but William McKinley would win pretty easily over William Jennings Bryan, who was an anti-imperialist. Again, this is the overall feeling Americans have, even though they don't necessarily understand all these moving pieces and why we'd be interested in Philadelphia in the Philippines. People still were okay in a general sense with us having that territory. So Growth of U.S. and power and pride. The decisive U.S. victory filled a lot of Americans with national pride. You're going to see that this is our first major conflict since the Civil War. So for the first time since the Civil War, a lot of Southerners shared in the U.S. pride in what had happened. European powers started to recognize after the Spanish-American War that the United States really was a force to be reckoned with, that we had a strong Navy, and that the United States now was willing to take an active role in international affairs with other countries. Now, shifting a little bit over to Asia, the open door policy. So, the late 1890s, Japan, Russia, Germany, France, Britain all had spheres of influence in China. They were all involved there in some way. 1899, once the United States starts to have some interest in them in China as well, Secretary of State John Hay, he would send a note to all these countries, and he'd say, hey, every country should have equal trade access to be able to do business with China. The United States, since we didn't really have any presence in China at all, the other countries are like, okay, we're not sure why you're sending us this letter. So the other nations weren't really committal in their responses to us, saying like, yeah, that's okay with us and that kind of thing. But because of their lack of enthusiasm and because of the lack of them really being committal on it at all, we kind of took that as a yes, like, hey, everybody's cool with this. It's kind of like I always liken it to, you write a letter to someone asking them out and say, check yes or no, and they don't respond, and you assume that just means yes, that they are interested in you. Yeah, it's kind of the same idea with the open door policy. So what the open door policy, again, means China is now open for business. Now, China during this time is going to have some issues, and there are going to be a group of people there known as the Boxers who have real issue with foreign influences, not just the U.S., but also other countries as well getting involved. These Chinese nationalists, they would rebel against foreigners and against pretty much all foreigners that were there in China. This would lead the U.S. to send 5,000 troops into China to help put down the rebellion. And this led to the second open door principle, which is the idea that China would be preserved as a territorial and administrative entity. And again, that doesn't mean we have control over China. That doesn't mean we're annexing it or anything like that. But that China should be basically its own thing outside of the influence of other countries, but still trading with other countries. And again, you're going to see those other European powers, they weren't in Japan, they weren't really inclined to defer to the U.S. in this situation, again, because we didn't have really much of a presence there. And so they didn't really see a need to defer to us in it, because it's kind of like, well, what say do you have in China? Because you're not even really super involved there. All right, shifting now to big stick diplomacy and Teddy Roosevelt. Unlike his predecessors, you're going to see Roosevelt had traveled very, very extensively, enjoyed studying world affairs. And Roosevelt, as far as his views, he believed America's role in the world was to uphold the country's honor in the community of nations. He believed in proper policing of the world in his statement. Basically, again, the United States should police the rest of the world if something is happening, such as what was happening in Cuba. He said that's a proper role of the United States to get involved there because of what was happening to the Cuban people. Also, he said we should maintain a balance of power, that would help us being involved would help maintain a balance of power around the world. And really that could be summed up in is speak softly and carry a big stick. That we had a very, very important role around the world, and basically saying, hey, we should speak nicely with what we say around the world, but at the same time, we should have a military and have a way of backing up so that if people don't, we can enforce our decisions upon them. So that brings us to the Panama Canal. Roosevelt during this time, again, remember going back to Alfred Thayer Mahan's book, part of that had said we should have a Central American canal. France had actually tried to do a Central American canal, but had failed. The project had gotten bogged down, and it just didn't end up working. So Roosevelt, he becomes president, and he says, hey, we need a canal through there. And he inquires of Colombia about leasing a strip of land across Panama, because at that time, Panama was under the control of Colombia, and the Colombian legislature said no. So that left Roosevelt with a couple options. One, the United States could go in and seize Panama, which again wouldn't really be, there wasn't a good reason to do that like it was in like the situation of Cuba. Or option two, help Panama in declaring independence from Colombia, because there already was in Panama this desire for independence from Colombia. And the United States is able to seize on that. Option two is going to be what Teddy Roosevelt chooses to do. We send covert assistance to Panama to assist in the revolution there, the independence movement. So, as a result of that, November 3rd, 1903, the U.S. recognizes Panama, and as part of that recognition, we later receive a perpetually renewable lease on the canal zone. And the U.S. would eventually pay Colombia $25 million in 1922 as kind of like, hey, sorry that we did that. But anyway, at this point, again, we have control of the Panama Canal, or that area. It would take 8 years, and it would open in 1914. Now, the Panama Canal, we would eventually return that over to the people of Panama in 1999. Jimmy Carter, in the late 1970s, he would negotiate that, and in 1999, we turned the canal back over to Panama. Hey, Pauncefote Agreement. Again, not very good at saying that. But in this, Britain gives up any treaty rights that they had to participate in a Central American canal. And again, this just shows, again, that growing relationship between the United States and Great Britain, and that they're like, hey, this is a U.S. thing. You do it. We are not going to intervene in that. So with this, you're going to see a change in the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine is still around, but Roosevelt's going to add his own twist on the Monroe Doctrine. And again, we already said he was in favor of speaking softly and carrying a big stick. And with this corollary, he is going to declare that the U.S. would act as a policeman of the world, of the Caribbean, stepping in flagrant cases of wrongdoing or impotence. This was done to help collect debts for European nations, and would be in addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Basically, what had happened is there were several countries within Latin America or South America that had debts with Europe, and we created this policy as a way of helping enforce and be able to collect that debt so that European countries could get it. You're going to see that we would use this policy to intervene in Latin America countless times. I have examples of 3 times there before pre the 1920s, but you're going to see throughout history that the United States, again, would use this as a reason to get involved within Latin and South America. Now, of course, this policy would hurt U.S. relations with Latin America, because Latin America felt like at this point, kind of our role was to strong arm them when European countries weren't doing what they wanted them to do. And eventually they felt like that it would be used by the U.S. to have control over Latin American countries. All right, shifting back to Asia over there, you're going to see that Japan would dominate. I've already mentioned kind of Japan, but Japan during this time was really, really growing. Japan had kind of been growing for a while. The U.S., we did not mind Japanese dominance in Asia. Japan had been doing really well since the Russo-Japanese War, which they had been kind of victorious in that. You will see within California, a lot of people did not like all the Asian Americans coming in there, and that would lead to the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, in which Japan agreed to restrict immigration to the U.S. if Roosevelt would persuade California to end their discriminatory laws. Again, a lot of people in Japan did not like this agreement because they felt like it was impinging on their honor, and it was very dishonorable of the U.S. to do this. Meanwhile, Roosevelt would increase American naval strength in the Pacific in order to balance power with Japan, because he was worried about how much Japan was growing in strength. And that's going to lead to the creation of what is known as the Great White Fleet, which would travel around the country or around the world, including Japan. And it was called the Great White Fleet. You can kind of see some of the U.S. ships there. They're all painted in this white color, and that is why they became known as that. But again, the reason that kind of went around the world was to show the U.S. military might that we had behind us now. In 1908, you'd have the Root-Takahira Agreement, and where the Japan and U.S., we would exchange notes pledging mutual respect for each other's possessions in the Pacific and support for the open door policy in China. And again, this is just another example of us working to create allies and also working in the Pacific to hopefully avoid conflicts. Now, when we're talking about this building China, again, building Japan, you're going to see this is going to be something that continues through the 1930s and kind of eventually is what pulls us into World War II. Now, Teddy Roosevelt, again, he was very, very eager to contribute to the cause of world peace. You will see that leads the United States to get involved in little ways in Europe after Germany challenges France over Morocco. The German Kaiser actually turns to Roosevelt and asks Roosevelt for her help. Roosevelt would arrange the Algeciras Conference in Spain in 1906 to hopefully ease those tensions, which it did. And as a result of that, you're going to see Teddy Roosevelt is nominated and gets a Nobel Peace Prize. So why is this what would seem like to most people meaningless conference? Why was that important? Well, it was a diplomatic triumph because Europe was working together, but also it led to a lot of people starting to view the U.S. as an apostle of peace. People said, the U.S., we could remain detached because we didn't have the interests going back to the old European rivalries and all that. So the U.S. stepping in, we're kind of like that third party that could step in and help with that. This French journalist here, he summed it up perfectly. He says the U.S. is a world power. Its power creates for us a duty to pronounce upon all those questions that hitherto have been arranged by agreement only by among European powers. The United States intervenes thus in the affairs of the universe. It is seated at the table where the great game is played, and it cannot leave. Again, just showing the importance of the power shift that this is going to bring in the power dynamic, how that is going to change. So, again, talking about the next president and what his policy looked like, President Taft and dollar diplomacy. So Taft entered office believing the U.S. had been shortchanged in some ways as far as policies, and that's why he would develop dollar diplomacy and the idea that American interests overseas would be protected. Basically, what this open door or dollar diplomacy was the idea that if companies would invest overseas, that we would protect their business interests overseas. So you will see, again, this was a way to help out businesses and encourage businesses. Hey, if you go to that country and you have another, let's say, Boxer rebellion in China, the U.S. is going to be there. We're going to help you out in those situations. We're not just going to leave you hanging over there. In Asia, Taft did support the Chinese Revolution of 1919 and the nationalists who wanted to liberate China from Japanese domination. Again, you can see a little bit of tension there building with Japan, whereas we talked about before that Teddy Roosevelt had been really reconciliatory towards Japan. Now, the next president, Woodrow Wilson. Wilson focused on reform in foreign and domestic affairs. He did not like the idea of dollar diplomacy because he felt like we were bullying weaker countries financially. And so he's going to bring a shift in foreign policy to what he called moral diplomacy. He said that we should foster constitutional liberty around the world and promise never again to seek one additional foot of territory by conquest. So again, Woodrow Wilson, he looks at this as we shouldn't be engaging in this imperialism and going and grabbing up territories like the Philippines and Puerto Rico and these areas. He's like, we shouldn't do that. We should promote liberty around the world, but we should not be in this for territorial gains. So what are going to be some changes that Wilson would make? With the Philippines, he would pass or sign the Jones Act that granted full territorial state to the Philippines, which gave them a Bill of Rights, voting, and promised independence once they created a stable government. So the Philippines would be good about that. That's something that they had wanted. Puerto Rico, in 1970, Congress would give Puerto Rico citizenship and provide for a limited government there. Panama Canal, when the Panama Canal had originally been set up, the United States did not have to pay taxes or pay the tolls going through that since we had built it. And Wilson is going to get rid of that and repeal that act so that we would have to pay the same tolls that anybody else did. Also, the conciliation treaties, and these are the kind of treaties that Woodrow Wilson tried to set up, in which the purpose of these was to negotiate treaties in which nations pledged to submit disputes to international commissions. So you're going to see with Wilson, when we talk about World War I, he was really big into countries working together internationally to try to figure things. So that was the purpose of these conciliation treaties is, hey, let's defer to these international commissions, have a one-year cooling off period before we use military actions, and hopefully that way to avoid wars around the world. And again, that's going to be his hope for World War I, which we'll talk about next class. Obviously, that does not happen now. 30 of these types of treaties would be passed, though. So you're going to see Wilson is going to take a much less aggressive stance on foreign policy. But he would intervene militarily when he needed to. His commitment to democracy, again, in relation to some areas, he wasn't as committed to that. He did keep troops in Nicaragua, sent troops into Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Within Mexico during this time, you would have a military dictator that would come to power after having the democratically elected president killed. In the Tampico incident, war is avoided with Mexico after the U.S. sailors went ashore at Tampico Bay. And you're going to see other countries actually mediate and help in that, which is good. The big thorn in our side, though, is going to be Pancho Villa. After the Mexican military dictator fell, a group of rebels led by Pancho Villa would lead raids across the U.S.-Mexico border. They were going across the U.S.-Mexico border, causing all kinds of issues with railroads and other things. With that, you're going to see President Wilson would order General John Pershing and a U.S. expeditionary force to go down to the border to pursue Pancho Villa in northern Mexico. So we were actually going into Mexico to pursue him. He was never captured, and eventually we would just withdraw from that due to World War I. You could say, if we're evaluating Wilson in this, that you could say he was doing it because he was trying to promote, again, constitutional liberty, again, with mentioning Mexico here and having a military dictator. So even though Wilson was, again, more reconciliatory in his policy and not as aggressive, when it came to people directly south of us, such as Mexico, he was, aggressive and willing to stand up for what he felt like were American interests in those situations. Again, these are, I'm going to show you some political cartoons. Whenever you are talking about imperialism, the AP exam, and the SOL alike, they love to put political cartoons on there having to do with an imperialization. You can see this one right here from the election of 1900 of William McKinley, again showing the two sides here, 1896, what things look like, and then 1900. And you can see the quote there in the middle: the American flag has not been planted in foreign soil to acquire more territory, but for humanity's sake. Again, trying to make the case that we are doing this for humanity, not to expand as a country. Here's another one here. This is I believe, Spanish cartoon, again, showing how people felt about us protecting Cuba there, obviously not in the right way. This one here is to represent, of course, the open door policy. And as far as the open door goes, us standing at that door with the key. This one right here, you have McKinley here serving Uncle Sam, and look at the menu there. You can get an idea of what Uncle Sam orders from that menu. I'll give you a hint, everything. I already showed you that cartoon there. Here's another one showing the U.S. kind of directing affairs and looking at what was going on in all of these different areas. Teddy Roosevelt there on top of the world. Us there, the U.S. about to partake and eat of some Hawaii in that situation. So again, be aware of these political cartoons and know them. I know there is a lot of information that I shared with you today over imperialism during this time. I encourage you to kind of slow it down and understand how each of these areas and what that looked like, and how really policy varied a lot by president. But early in the 20th century, there was a big push by the United States for imperialism and to get involved in other countries and to exert our influence when we needed to. And of course, Teddy Roosevelt there was very, very willing to do that, probably more so than any president had been at this point in, or at that point in history. So hope you enjoyed this. Again, sorry that it is long. It is a lot of important information, though, for you to get. Hope you have a fantastic day.